Canada may have just made the most consequential economic decision in its modern history. This is not about a routine trade trip or a symbolic diplomatic gesture. What we are watching could be the early stages of a structural shift in North American power. The Canadian Prime Minister's decision to launch a 12-day trade mission to India, Australia, and Japan signals something far bigger than diversification. It signals that Ottawa is seriously preparing for a world where economic dependence on the United States is no longer safe. To understand why this matters, you have to look at the timing. The announcement came just hours after the U.S. Supreme Court struck down several emergency tariffs that had been imposed on Canadian exports. Under normal circumstances, that would ease tensions. Instead, Washington responded with new tariff mechanisms under different legal authorities. That sequence tells you something important. The trade conflict is no longer about specific policies. It is about leverage and control. Over the past year, the relationship between Washington and Ottawa has deteriorated sharply. Tariffs of 25% and higher were placed on broad categories of Canadian goods. There were threats of even more extreme measures if Canada deepened trade ties with China. Rhetoric escalated beyond economics into sovereignty, including repeated suggestions that Canada should become the 51st state. Whether those comments were strategic or theatrical, they reshaped Canadian political thinking. When a superpower openly questions your autonomy, diversification stops being optional. Canada's outreach to China earlier this year, including tariff reductions on electric vehicles in exchange for agricultural concessions, was widely interpreted as retaliation. But the larger pivot now underway suggests something more calculated. At the World Economic Forum, the Canadian Prime Minister framed the global system as fractured and unstable. He argued that middle powers must build networks that reduce dependence on any single superpower. That speech now reads less like theory and more like policy. The current trade structure explains the urgency. Roughly 3/4 of Canadian exports go to the United States. Nearly $4 billion in goods cross the border every day. Energy integration is deep. Canada supplies the majority of U.S. crude oil imports and a significant portion of U.S. electricity and uranium. At the same time, Canada is the top export market for more than 30 U.S. states. The dependence is mutual, but asymmetrical. The U.S. economy is large enough to absorb shocks. Canada's is not. The trip to India is central to Ottawa's strategy. India is one of the fastest growing major economies and faces enormous energy demand growth over the next 2 decades. Canada has natural gas, uranium, agricultural capacity, and critical minerals. India needs long-term supply stability as it reduces exposure to Russian energy and manages competition with China. A comprehensive trade agreement could double bilateral trade within a decade. For Canada, India represents scale. For India, Canada offers political stability and resource reliability. Australia is the second pillar. When a foreign leader addresses both houses of Australia's parliament, it signals strategic intent. Australia and Canada share similar economic structures. Resource-rich, advanced democracies, deeply tied to Western alliances, yet geographically positioned in the Indo-Pacific. Both possess critical minerals essential for batteries, clean energy, and defense technologies. Coordinated supply chains between them could reduce reliance on Chinese processing and American intermediaries. That would create a parallel resource network with significant geopolitical weight. Japan is arguably the most delicate component. Japan remains closely aligned with the United States, but it has watched recent American trade tactics with caution. Japan imports most of its food and energy. Canada can supply both. Clean energy partnerships, liquefied natural gas exports, and agricultural contracts would deepen economic interdependence. However, Japanese corporations are deeply embedded in the American market. Any aggressive pivot away from U.S. supply chains would risk retaliation. Canada is therefore not offering Japan a replacement alliance, but a supplementary one that reduces vulnerability without forcing a break. Behind these bilateral efforts lies a broader concept sometimes described as an expanded Indo-Pacific economic alignment. India, Australia, Japan, and potentially others are exploring cooperation in artificial intelligence, nuclear technology, and critical mineral processing. The key feature is redundancy. Instead of one dominant hub, the system becomes networked. For middle powers, redundancy equals resilience. The challenge is scale and speed. Canada aims to double non-U.S. exports to roughly $600 billion over the next decade. That implies building an economy equivalent to a mid-sized European country, almost from scratch in external trade terms. Infrastructure constraints are real. Ports, liquefaction facilities, mineral processing plants, and shipping corridors cannot be expanded overnight. Long-term contracts take years to negotiate and implement. Markets are sticky. Supply chains do not pivot quickly. Meanwhile, Washington retains enormous leverage. Tariffs can be raised rapidly. Regulatory approvals can be delayed. Cross-border infrastructure, such as the new bridge between Detroit and Windsor, can become bargaining chips. Even rhetorical escalation can deter private investment by increasing uncertainty. The United States does not need to sever trade to exert pressure. It only needs to make alternatives look risky. At the same time, American leverage is not unlimited. Many U.S. states depend heavily on exports to Canada. Energy flows are deeply integrated. Replacing Canadian crude or electricity would be expensive and slow. In a full economic escalation, both economies would suffer. That mutual vulnerability may ultimately act as a constraint. The strategic backdrop is the upcoming review of the North American Trade Agreement in 2026. If that framework collapses, tariffs could return across wide sectors. Canada's current outreach appears designed to strengthen its bargaining position before those negotiations begin. Diversification does not require complete decoupling to be effective. Even shifting 20% of trade elsewhere would reduce coercive pressure. There is also a financial dimension. A recently announced multi-billion-dollar investment partnership with the United Arab Emirates signals that Canada is seeking capital inflows alongside trade deals. Infrastructure, clean energy, and technology investments can accelerate export capacity. Foreign direct investment reduces transition costs and signals international confidence. Three broad scenarios emerge. The first is that diversification proves slower and more limited than advertised. Agreements are signed, but volumes remain modest. Canada ultimately negotiates renewed trade terms with the United States from a position that is somewhat stronger, but still constrained. The second is a gradual hybrid model in which Canada remains integrated with the U.S. while building meaningful secondary markets. This would create persistent friction but manageable coexistence. The third, least desirable scenario is escalation into a sustained economic confrontation, with high tariffs and retaliatory measures disrupting supply chains and energy markets. That outcome would impose significant costs on both sides and ripple globally. Which path is most likely depends less on trade arithmetic and more on political incentives. If Washington views diversification as hostile defiance, escalation becomes more probable. If it interprets it as predictable risk management, negotiations may stabilize the relationship. For Ottawa, the calculus is about insurance. Over-reliance on a single partner in an era of volatile politics carries strategic risk. What makes this moment significant is not that Canada can fully replace the United States. In the short term, it cannot. The significance lies in whether middle powers can build enough economic redundancy to reduce vulnerability to political pressure. If Canada demonstrates partial success, other U.S. allies may pursue similar strategies. That would not end American influence, but it would dilute it. Ultimately, this is a test of interdependence. For decades, North American integration was seen as irreversible. Now it is conditional. The next several months will reveal whether diversification becomes structural policy or negotiating theater. Either way, the assumption that economic alignment with Washington is permanent and unquestioned has already been challenged. And once that assumption is broken, the strategic landscape changes for everyone.